Many towns and villages, which once formed the heart of rural communities, are becoming plagued by dereliction. The remains of ghost estates still linger, while our cities suffer from major housing shortages. Congestion on commuter routes is grinding to a halt. Ireland's population is expected to grow by about 1 million over the next 2 decades. We're now building again under a new vision for spatial planning. I want to know what direction Ireland is now taking, in where and how we build, and why spatial planning matters to us all. For most of human history, we've lived in small interdependent communities. From early ring fort and monastic settlements to clock-on communal villages, which later evolved into market towns. In the 19th century, blight, famine and the Industrial Revolution led to the massive movement from country to city life. To escape city squalor, tenement living and air pollution, new rail lines enabled people to resettle in new towns, in attractive amenity areas where they walked or cycled short trips. Mass production of the motor car facilitated many to build larger homes out of town on green field sites, or low-density areas where rail became redundant. Irish people now spend more time in cars than any country in Europe. The health impacts of this is now being taken seriously by a new cross-governmental initiative called Healthy Ireland, led by Kate O'Flaherty.
The health and well-being of our population is pretty much our greatest asset. The economic and social progress of our country depends on the health of our population, but we face many challenges. We have an ageing population, chronic diseases are on the rise, and that really points towards a very costly future, both in terms of healthcare costs, but also in terms of lives lost and quality of life lost. A lot of that chronic disease, from diabetes to heart disease to some dementias to some cancers, it's preventable through the lifestyle choices that we make.
How does our built environment affect our health?
For example, the way that our cities and towns are planned and how we plan our transport can impact on our ability to be physically active. Footpaths, cycle paths, where the location of things are planned, such as schools, relative to where people live. Safety is very important, so that people feel safe, that they can be out and about and choose to walk or cycle. Another thing is having access to green space and to nature. It's really important as we plan for the future that we think about how do we, on a very practical level, make those changes easier for people to do in terms of going around their daily lives.
What we build, how we build, and where we build has long-lasting impacts for society. Here in Dublin, the major shortage of homes within the city has driven a building boom that's struggling to catch up with demand.
Ireland is building again, and with the pressure to build new homes, I want to find out if we're finally getting it right.
Dr. Conor Norton is one of Ireland's foremost experts on sustainable spatial planning.
Conor, have we lessons to learn from what we've done in the past?
I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. The sort of, if you want to call it urbanism that we followed was essentially an urbanism that was around suburbanisation.
Sprawl.
Sprawl.
And what are the problems with low density development like that?
Low density means that people are in fact dependent on the car, and we find it very hard to provide public transport services in an economic fashion to low density areas. Where we don't have an adequate density, if you like, of population, we don't get the critical mass for local services, local shops. The effect has been, in some cases, catastrophic for small villages and towns in particular. We have witnessed a very great loss of population and community, and that has had social, it's had economic, and it's had environmental impacts for small towns and villages.
When we look at new development in our countryside, we know that farmers need to live in the country. It's critical to them, but development that sprawls out like one-off houses, how do we deal with that issue into the future?
At this moment in time, many people are arguing that we have enough one-off housing, enough of that type of stock in the rural countryside, and we just have to manage that stock now. The key issue is not one-off housing itself, but it's the one-off housing that's generated by people who probably should be living in towns and villages and cities, but are choosing or given the option to live in the rural countryside. It's important to distinguish between urban generated housing and the housing that's associated with established communities, rural businesses, enterprise and agriculture. I think what we need to do is we need to try and get the communities back into our town centres, our city centres and our village centres. We need to get very, very high quality apartments and townhouses and variety and choice. But families will choose to come into an urban centre if the educational facilities are there, if there's a very high quality urban environment, if it's a safe place for children, if it's not dominated by traffic, and it offers a lot of advantages over the other options that are out there.
With the shortage of family accommodation in the city, Dublin's commuter belts are extending further out, while roads are reaching their tolerable limits of congestion. So can Ireland's other cities shoulder some of this growth, attract jobs and build sustainably? Waterford is Ireland's smallest and oldest city, but is arguably doing the most to fix the problems of their planning past. Their now famous 46-kilometre greenway to Dungarvan is a sign of their commitment. Local resident Eamon McEnany is director of Waterford's museums. He also plays a major part in helping to shape the rejuvenation of Waterford City.
Here we're over the medieval vaults of the old palace. Originally the palace faced towards the cathedral in the 18th century, and again they were rethinking the city in the 18th century. This is the town wall, and they were saying, let's build the palace that it's faced outwards. The gentry and the people of Waterford, when they call it promenading up here in the middle of the 18th century of a summer's evening, they would see this beautiful facade.
Right.
And the idea was, again, to make the city a livable place for people. And we're trying to recapture that again in the 21st century. This area here, for example, was a car park up to 10 years ago. We put up sculptures here that were a bit interactive, and I'd say there's scarcely a Saturday that you wouldn't come here. There'd be a married couple coming here to have their photograph taken.
This was a car park going back?
This was a car park, yeah. And actually that was a car park and Cathedral Square was a car park. So
right.
All of this has been pedestrianised. We've unblocked this archway here. This was always an archway in the 18th century. And then here you've got social housing. The ground floor is for people of a certain age. And then the top 2 floors are for families. And we're developing these here. These are the oldest houses in Ireland. The timbers in these houses go back to the 1460s.
It's a massive amount of history.
Oh, the whole town is layered in history.
And have you pedestrianised in other shopping streets?
Oh yeah, most of the shopping streets are pedestrianised. You need spaces that people can walk into your shop. They know they can't park immediately outside the door anymore. That's a 1960s idea. It's no longer viable in Ireland.
So what's your vision now for Waterford, say 10 years from now or into the future?
Well, I'd hope in 20 years or 10 years' time, the North Quays would be developed and we'd have people living there as well, and that we'd have people living in the city centre, and that the spaces above all these shops here, people are actually going to be living in them and participating in urban life like the way they should be, like it has been for 1,000 years.
Most of Ireland's building space above street level in towns and cities are predominantly underutilised, obsolete or vacant. However, a few people are still living in Waterford above the shops. So I'm visiting Marjorie OConnor to see how she finds it.
How are you?
Good to see you.
Come in.
Yeah, what a place to live. Panoramic views on the river.
Absolutely, isn't it amazing?
Wow. How long have you lived here, Marjorie?
I'm living here 43 years.
Right, and do you like it?
It's a long time. I love it. I wouldn't really want to live anywhere else because one is very close to everything. Shops, theatre, there's always hustle and bustle around, and I live alone and I'm never lonely.
So would you live outside the city?
No. Well, first of all, you'd have to travel to come here, and that's where I want to be. Do you know what I mean? And most people do. If you're coming to theatre, cinema, You have to travel if you're outside, where in the city, everything is on your doorstep. Then they're a nice place to walk that lifts the spirit. Our city council, I'm very impressed with them. The Viking Triangle has made such a difference. I've met people now, tourists, that have said to me, "Aren't you lucky to be living here?" And I am. I'm very proud of my city, actually.
It's great to see people like Marjorie truly enjoying urban life. But making the city desirable for family homes is a major new challenge. Already, the pedestrian areas are attracting people back in for shopping and for social and cultural experiences. These changes are part of Waterford's designation by the World Health Organization as a healthy city. And I'm meeting local coordinator, Brianna Connaughton.
Can you tell me about what you're trying to achieve with Healthy Waterford?
In a nutshell, what we're trying to achieve is how do we make our city and our places that we live healthier. We look at all the elements of health, and that it takes in our mental health, our connectedness, our relationships, our family environment, work environment. So we look at how all of those elements impact our overall health and well-being.
So what sort of changes do you think we need to make?
I suppose changes in our environment, changes in terms of the infrastructure, the community. For example, the development of the North Quays.
Across here?
Yeah, across here. There's nothing there at the moment. There's a huge residential population over this side of the town, and it's completely disconnected except for one bridge, which is predominantly for the use of cars.
On the North Quays are plans for a sustainable, compact extension to the city centre, where over 400 homes are proposed for the first phase. The new apartment living will be family friendly with ample outdoor amenity space.
The development of the North Quays will have a footbridge that will come across. It's a sustainable transport bridge, so it'll be for cyclists, pedestrians.
So is your generally policy is to try and minimise use of cars in cities, is it?
Yes, and we have a lot of cycle paths around Waterford City. The key here was changed a couple of years ago in terms of to discourage traffic coming through the city centre. The lanes were narrowed and there's roundabouts put into slow traffic movement. Other things is we've had the development of our Greenway, which has been a huge success. You can actually connect with the Greenway by the end of the quay here, and once the bridge and the North Quays development is finished, they'll look to connect the sustainable transport bridge with the Greenway.
This gives me hope that Waterford is now going in the right direction, and maybe this success will encourage our bigger cities to follow their example. But over 2 million people live in rural Ireland or in the catchments of smaller towns and villages. And it's Ireland's towns that seem mostly in trouble. So what can be done to breathe new life and vibrancy back into these rural towns?